Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Repeat Ron, and today we're going to be going over the sharpshooter weapons from worst to best in my opinion. Now sharpshooter has a lot of very good weapons. The majority of their weapons are really strong, but they do have some outliers that aren't as good. I don't think any of their weapons are terrible, but there are a few that are a little bit lacking compared to the others. So really the first three weapons I would say on this list are lacking in one way or another, but after that, all of the weapons are pretty solid and all of them are pretty good. So let's get started. Sharpshooter currently has 12 weapons. They technically have 13 with the HRG Beluga Beat just added in, but that's still in the beta and it recently got changed from the last beta changes. So it's not fully out and there could still be more stuff that gets changed about it. So I have omitted that from this list. It won't be on here. First impressions of the Beluga Beat are that it's pretty good. It's actually really strong for sharpshooter, especially if you're not the best shot with it. So hopefully it stays that way, but we'll see once it's fully released. So that's why it's not on the list. Other than that, all the other weapons are, and let's get started with number 12. So at our number 12th spot, we have the single Spitfire. This one honestly was pretty easy to pick out. This one is the really odd weapon out with sharpshooter. So this weapon isn't awful as a backup weapon by any means. It's pretty decent. I have actually done a whole video that was 4 rounds hell on earth only using this with sharpshooter and managed to do it. It wasn't super easy, but we did manage to do it. So the Spitfire weighs 2. It's a cross perk weapon between actually 3 classes: Gunslinger, Sharpshooter, and Firebug. It does 40 damage per shot, as well as doing fire damage. Fire damage does damage over time. This can vary depending on how long something is on fire, and if floor fires are also to be factored in. This has a pretty high rate of fire and really no recoil when firing it, so it's not bad for that. The reason why this weapon scores so low, though, is that it doesn't fit the playstyle of sharpshooter very well. The fire damage is kind of neglectable because you don't have any bonuses to get more fire damage and continue that, or continue doing something like floor fires and do more damage like how Firebug does this, where the Spitfires are really good on Firebug, but they're not the best on every other class. This weapon also has a much slower projectile speed than your other weapons, so it's much more difficult to hit headshots with the Spitfire, at least consistently. It's not the hardest thing in the world, and at medium to close range you can do it pretty consistently, but once enemies get a little ways out, you can really feel how slow the Spitfire fire is actually moving, to where you're no longer able to hit consistent headshots, and it might just be easier to go for body shots or just go for things like floor fires to deal more damage, which works against small things, but against big things, it's not really that useful. Once again, for like 2-8, if you're going to take this as a backup weapon, it's okay in that role, or a backup to your backup weapon, it's okay in that role, and it actually upgrades pretty well, increasing by 25% more damage with each level, and its first level it gets no additional weight. So throwing an upgrade into it right away isn't really that bad of an idea. Coming in on our number 11 spot is another sidearm. This is the single 1858 Revolver. This also weighs 2. This is a cross perk weapon between Sharpshooter and Gunslinger. This weapon does 50 damage a shot. It shoots fairly fast, just as fast as the Spitfire. It holds 6 rounds, and it's a pretty straightforward revolver. It does scale pretty well with upgrades. Actually, the first 2 upgrades don't increase its weight at all, so that's pretty nice. And they do actually give it a pretty decent amount of damage with those upgrades. And this weapon is actually really good to take early on if you're playing like a 7 or a 10 round map, because you can grab this and use your Winchester and pretty much destroy everything early on for a very cheap amount of money. You can also pick this up off the ground, which is really good. Or if you're a gunslinger, or maybe your survivalist who spawned in with this doesn't like it as much, they could toss you one of them, and that could be really useful for you, at least throughout the early waves. And for that, it's perfectly fine. It's also perfectly fine as a backup weapon, or a backup to your backup weapon. It's an okay-ish weapon, but it has limitations, and it's not one of their best weapons. Alright, and then at our number 10 spot, we have the M99 AMR. This is the tier 5 sharpshooter weapon. This is the 50 caliber sniper rifle. This thing weighs 12. It's a single shot rifle. It does 850 damage with its shot. It doesn't get any upgrades. This weapon is super fun to use. I actually do really like using the 50 cal, but it's not very good on Sharpshooter. 12 weight really limits you as to what you can take, because that only leaves you with 3 weight that you can carry. That pretty much means you're taking a pistol, one of the revolvers, or you are taking an off-perk weapon, potentially something like a medic SMG to just be somewhat useful then. It costs a lot at 2,500 Dosh, so you're not getting this until very late into the game, assuming you're not playing on like Endless, and you can just get this and keep going. You also do not get a lot of ammo with this, only 21 shots in total before you have to go and find ammo, and your ammo pickup is really bad of only 2 rounds every time you pick up ammo. So it's very limiting that way. The only time you're ever really going to see this is on boss wave, and if you are able to just constantly hit the boss with this, you can do tons of damage to them, and it's really satisfying for that. This weapon is honestly better on Survivalist than it is on Sharpshooter, where Survivalist can actually grab another gun. At our number 9 spot, we have the Compound Bow. This is the other tier 5 weapon that Sharpshooter has. This weapon doesn't cost as much as the 50 cal. This is only 2,000 Dosh rather than 2,500. This is a single shot weapon because it's a bow and arrow. This can be fired either with the regular arrows or be fired with the frost arrows by switching to them. So the compound bow has 2 different firing modes, or 2 different arrows. It's just regular arrows that do 250 damage of piercing. They can punch through multiple enemies. Pretty straightforward. It's the same as like the crossbow bolts. With its secondary fire, it shoots cryo arrows. These do 50 damage when they hit an enemy, and then 25 damage to everything around it because it counts as an explosion. The explosion can freeze multiple enemies, and it's kind of useful that you can freeze enemies. You can also pick up your regular shot arrows, unless you use the frozen arrows, in which case you can't. That's another kind of issue with this. This does also have a spike on it, where you can stab things with it, which is kind of useful. The spike does 100 damage on bash. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of the compound bow. It's an okay weapon overall. It does its job quite well, but I find it just not as useful as the crossbow in most situations, so that's why it lands here at number 9. And speaking of the crossbow, here at number 8, we have the crossbow. This is a tier 2 weapon for Sharpshooter. This holds 1 shot. It holds 34 extra arrows. It weighs 6. I should have mentioned the compound bow weighs 8. Sorry about that. The crossbow does 350 damage per shot, so it actually does more than the compound bow, just regularly. It actually scales really well with upgrades too, so the crossbow is worth throwing upgrades into if you wish to keep it. And overall, I think the crossbow is a fantastic weapon, but it does have some limitations. On certain maps, you can potentially lose your bolts because they'll just fly out of the map and you can't go get them. So that makes it a little bit more annoying to use the crossbow because you're going to just have to keep buying full ammo back. Full ammo for the crossbow isn't super expensive, but it is a little bit annoying to keep having to do that rather than save up your bolts, because that's usually what you want to do with the crossbow. Is it's good for saving money, and it's good for killing big things as well as punching through multiple small things. Overall, I really like the crossbow, but does have its limitations. At number 7, we have the 500 Magnum. This is a cross-perk weapon between Sharpshooter and Gunslinger, and this is probably the best sidearm type weapon that Sharpshooter gets. This weighs 3, it holds 5 shots, it does 160 damage per shot, which is a lot of damage for a pistol. It's also quite accurate, and it has a decent rate of fire. It is slower than the other revolvers by a little bit, but it is more powerful than them. It also scales pretty well with its 1 upgrade, taking it up to a weight of 4. That's not too bad. Overall, the 500 makes a perfectly good sidearm for Sharpshooter, and it's overall a pretty decent gun to take with really any weapon for them. At number 6, we have the Mosin Nagant. This is the bolt-action rifle that is also a DLC weapon for Sharpshooter. The Mosin holds 5 rounds, it weighs 7, it's also attached with a bayonet. This weapon does 250 damage. The bayonet can do 100 damage with its stab, and it actually has one of the longest reaches out of any melee weapon. You can also parry with this weapon. So this is an extremely versatile weapon. It also scales quite well with upgrades. It doesn't shoot the fastest because it is a bolt-action rifle. And the sights, some people have complained that the sights aren't the most open, which they aren't, but I don't find them too bad. I really enjoy the Mosin Nagant. I think it's a fantastic weapon. If it was at a lower weight, it would definitely score higher up on this list. It would also score really high on just a general weapons list if it counted as a melee weapon where you could take it with Berserker and Survivalist though too. Then it would actually probably be a real top tier weapon. It's still a pretty high tier weapon. Maybe not top tier, but definitely high up there. All right, down to the top 5, and all of these weapons, and really number 6 was really good too. All of these weapons are fantastic all the way around. And coming in at number 5, we have the M14 EBR. This is a semi-automatic rifle for Sharpshooter. This is a tier 3 weapon. It holds 20 rounds. It weighs 7. It does 80 damage per shot at a decent rate of fire. This also has an ACOG scope and a laser sight on it, which is quite nice to use. Makes lining up headshots from firing from the hip much easier for newer players. And at 7 weight, it's kind of a similar position to the Mosin, where it can be a little bit difficult to fit into certain loadouts. I think if it weighed 1 less, I also think if this weapon was a cross perk weapon with either somebody like Commando or with SWAT, they could make use of it better. But overall, the M14 is still a pretty capable weapon. It's very nice to use if you have the rack 'em up skill. It's great for getting a bunch of rack 'em up and keeping it. That's always nice. No real downsides to the M14. It's just on an all-around pretty solid weapon overall. All right, at number 4, we have the FN-FAL ACOG. This is a cross-perk weapon between Sharpshooter and Commando. This weapon weighs 8. It holds 20 rounds. It does 70 damage per shot. It has the same rate of fire as the M14 in semi-auto, but nearly triple the rate of fire in full auto. The reason why I put this weapon higher than the M14, even though it does have one additional weight, is that you can do more damage per second with this than you can the M14. And that's really the only factor that actually made me put it higher than the M14. The M14 does scale better than it with upgrades. The FAL scales perfectly fine with upgrades though. Both of them end up being 9 weight when they're fully upgraded. So both weapons are pretty comparable then, where you can either argue for more damage per shot or more damage per second. And that's why they get 5th and 4th, respectively. At number 3, we have the Winchester 1894. This one might be surprising to some people. This is your starting weapon as Sharpshooter. And I honestly believe that it's one of Sharpshooter's best weapons. It fits very well with most weapons. It's a starting weapon, so it's very cheap for you to buy. It only weighs 4. It holds 12 rounds in it. This is also a cross-perk weapon with Gunslinger. Gunslinger can use it as well, and Gunslinger can use it quite well with them. This does 80 damage per shot, has a pretty decent rate of fire, and it scales incredibly well with upgrades. It actually goes up to a pretty crazy amount of damage when it's fully upgraded, having 2.5 times more damage than base, taking it up to 200 damage per shot at a weight of 9. This weapon is incredibly powerful. I really like the sights on it. This is also a great weapon to pick up off the ground for really any class because it is just so powerful just at level 1. And it pairs pretty well with any other sharpshooter weapon. So that's why the Winchester gets number 3. Coming in at number 2, we have the SPX 464 centerfire rifle. This is a tier 2 weapon for Sharpshooter. It's also a cross-perk weapon with Gunslinger because it's a lever action gun again. This weapon weighs 5, it holds 10 rounds in it, and it does 165 damage a shot, which is pretty much the same as the 500 Magnum, but you get 5 more rounds and an optical sight on it, which is pretty nice, but a slower reload like all the lever action rifles, or just lever action guns. This has the same rate of fire as the Winchester, which is pretty decent. It scales incredibly well with upgrades. It's one of the highest scaling weapons with upgrades in terms of damage. This thing gets even stronger than the Winchester, nearly getting to, I believe it's 280-ish damage per shot. And this weapon, just like the Winchester, fits really well with any of the other weapons that Sharpshooter has. And that's where its big strength lies, is that it synergizes so well with so many of their weapons. So that's why the centerfire gets number 2. And number 1, we have the Railgun. The Railgun is the highest damaging practical weapon for Sharpshooter. The 50 cal does do more damage than it, but it's not really as practical. So the Railgun holds 1 round in it. It weighs 9. It does 560 damage per shot, assuming you're not using the targeted fire. If you're using the targeted fire, it does half that damage at 280, and you should never turn on the targeted fire with this weapon. It's just going to cost you so much damage that you could have, and really makes the weapon much less impressive if you have that turned on. This weapon also has a pretty slow rate of fire, as you'd imagine with a single shot weapon. All the single shot weapons have a pretty slow rate of fire. This weapon does scale really well with its one upgrade, taking it from 560 damage up to 700 damage for one additional weight, taking it up to 10 weight. 10 weight does restrict you on what you can take, but not as much as 12 weight would with the 50 cal. And I'm really going to be comparing this heavily to the 50 cal because that's the most obvious comparison. This weapon is generally going to be better than the 50 cal in almost every match. The Railgun is still perfectly capable of killing pretty much any large Zed, flesh pound, Scrake, whatever it might be. Almost all of your even small weapons with Sharpshooter are pretty capable of doing that. Things like the Winchester, centerfire, even the M14 and the FAL can kill Scrakes and flesh pounds fairly quickly. The Railgun really just rips right through them. So this is where I'd put all of Sharpshooter's weapons. Tell me what your thoughts are down below and where you would rank them. I'm really curious to see where you guys would put this. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Thank you guys so very much for watching this. Tell me if you'd like to see another worst to best list in any of the other classes. I'm down to making any of them. And if you guys are new here and you're not already subscribed, be sure that you get subscribed. That way you get notifications whenever I post any of these videos. And thank you guys so much for watching this. I really do appreciate it, and I will talk to all of you guys next time. Till then, stay cool, and bye.